Namaskar. Respected Madhav Kaushikji, President Sahitya Akademi, eminent poet, respected Harprasad Dasji, Dr. Gaurahari Dasji, Convener, Uriya Advisory Board, Sahitya Akademi, Chandrasekhar Hota, Secretary, Orissa Sahitya Akademi, Katrabasi Nayak, Officer in Charge, Regional Office, Calcutta Sahitya Akademi, all the distinguished poets who had read out their poetic creation just now, and the cultured souls present in this august hall. Neither am I a scholar, nor do I possess scholarship. Neither am I a poet, though sometimes I do write poetry like something. But then why this audacity on my part? I have a sense of offering anything and everything, whatever I think, whatever I did, at the lotus feet of the Supreme Divine Mother. And this sense of surrender is the sole strength of my strength and audacity. Let first me express my gratitude to eminent poet Harprasad Dasji, because he has indeed delighted me. He has very brilliantly and effectively and perfectly exposed the vagueness of Western intellectual hegemony, which I have been doing on my part in my limited sphere, but of course with many imperfections. But his lecture has indeed moved me, has indeed delighted me at a time when educated India is still hypnotized by the glamour of European culture. At a time when educated India is filled with a deep sense of inferiority. And as a mark of respect and gratitude to Dr. Harprasad Das, let me pronounce two assertions made by Sri Aurobindo 100 years ago. Sri Aurobindo said in his magnum opus, Foundations of Indian Culture, Sri Aurobindo said, the modern world is still mainly European, a world dominated by the European mind and Western civilization. And he asserted subsequently what he asserted, and very emphatically, very categorically, when India was subjugated, when India was not a free nation 100 years ago, he says, we claim to set right this undue preponderance, to reassert the Asiatic and for ourselves the Indian mind, and to preserve and develop the great values of Asiatic and of Indian civilization. In the last page of his Foundations of Indian Culture, in the very last page, what he wrote, let me quote. He says, India of the ages is not dead, nor has she spoken her last creative word. She lives and has still something to do for herself and the human peoples. And that which must seek now to awake is not an anglicized Oriental people, docile pupil of the West, and doomed to repeat the cycles of the Occident success and failure, but still the ancient, immemorable Shakti recovering her deepest self, lifting her head higher towards the supreme source of light and strength, and turning to discover the complete meaning and a vaster form of her dharma, unquote. But the modern poetry now posits itself that poetry is layered and complex, claiming and confirming effectively that poetry is nothing but a paradox and riddle. Poetry is nothing but a paradox and riddle that requires unraveling. Through a complex combination of metaphors, similes, symbols, and imagery, poetry actually invites the readers to peel back these layers and uncover the inherent meanings embedded within the text. The readers are to decipher the layers with which poem is created by the poet. But personally, I envision poetry as a transformative power. Transformative power that awakens humanity to its innate divinity, propelling us towards the next stage of human evolution. I wish poetry to forge a deep, intimate connection with the readers, resonating with their innermost selves, appealing their heart and soul more and more. Let me here quote what the Rasa Gangadhara, written in the 18th century, 17th-18th century by Pandit Raj Jagannath, how he defines poetry. He defines poetry that poetry is word which conveys beautiful sense. So poetry has to convey beautiful sense. Poetry is not to be made incomprehensible. Poetry is to convey. And he says the exact Sanskrit is Ramaniyartha Pratipadaka Shabda Kavyam. Ramaniyartha Pratipadaka Shabda Kavyam. Poetry is word which conveys beautiful sense. So it is translated by another writer as the words which raises the charming sense to comprehension is poetry. So the comprehensibility, the poet has to convey his meaning. Poet has to convey his meaning, whether incomprehensibility is poet's strength or not, I am personally not aware. And the Sahitya Prakash of 11th century, I am always advocating the India's eternal literary theories. I am always exposing the so-called postmodernism. What is modernism? It is nothing but the replacement of divinity by humanity. But I will continue to worship only divinity, because I will not worship this imperfect humanity. I wish humanity to become divine. So I will continue to worship only divinity. So I am rejecting this modern age which is being produced in the Western factory. So I will continue to worship divinity. I will not replace humanity. I will not replace divinity by imperfect humanity. I will continue to worship. And the Sahitya Kavya Prakash of Muhammad Bhatta, written 11th century, defines poetry as Tada Dosho Sabdartha Shaguna Balankarati Punah Kapi. That means the word Kavya Prakasha defines Kavya as Shabda and Artha. As Shabda and Artha without dosha. As Shabda and Artha without dosha, possessing guna and decorated with alankaras. Decorated with alankaras, possessing guna and Shabda and Artha without dosha. So we are to advocate this in India's eternal literary theories. We are to expose the Western intellectual hegemony. And now let me quote Sri Aurobindo. He has referred to poetry in many of his writings. He has quoted and he has referred to today's poetry and the poetry of the Vedic age in one of his another magnum opus on social theories. It is titled as The Human Cycle. So Aurobindo says, to us means to the modern mind, to us poetry is a revel. Poetry is a revel of intellect and fancy. Imagination, what is imagination for us? A plaything and caterer for our amusement, our entertainment. And the nuts girl of the mind, poetry to the men of all. He says, but to the man of the old, the poet was a seer. The poet was a seer, a revealer of hidden truths. Imagination no dancing courtesan, but a priestess in God's house. Commissioned not to spin fiction, commissioned not to spin fiction, but to image difficult and hidden truths. And what is metaphor to them? What was metaphor to them? And what is metaphor to us? Even the metaphor or simile in the Vedic style is used with a serious purpose. And what was that serious purpose? And expected to convey a reality, not to suggest a pleasing artifice of thought. But what was that purpose? He says, the image was to these seers a revelative symbol of the unrevealed. A revelative symbol of the unrevealed. And it was used because it could hint luminously to the mind what the precise intellectual word, apt only for logical and practical thought. Because the intellectual words are only apt for logical or practical thought. That is why they used metaphor. What the precise intellectual word, apt only for logical or practical thought, or to explain the physical and the superficial, could not at all hope to manifest. And that is why they were using metaphor, not to spin fiction. And last, let me quote Sri Aurobindo again. He says, poetry has three powers. Poetry has three powers. And he has written this in his magnum opus on poetics. That is the name of the book. It is the title of the book is The Future Poetry. It is a magnificent work on poetry. In my opinion, it is the supreme production. And it is, the Bengali translation was done by an Uriya. The future poetry was translated into Bengali, not by an Bengali, but by an Uriya. And here, in Diyar, Sri Aurobindo says, poetry comes into being at the direct call of three powers. And what are those three powers? He says, first one is inspiration. Second one is beauty. Third one is delight. So inspiration, beauty, and delight, these are the three powers of poetry. And brings them to us. So poetry brings them to us and us to them. Poetry brings us to them and poetry brings them to us. By the magic charm of the inspired rhythmic word, by the magic charm of the inspired rhythmic word, if it can do that at all perfectly, its essential work has been done. Its essential work has been done. If poetry has brought inspiration, beauty and delight to me, and if poetry brings me to inspiration, beauty and delight, then the work has been done. Then the work has been done. And last one quote, he writes this thing in his another small book, but it is also a masterpiece, the value of, national value of art. Because poetry is also an art. He says the first and lowest use of art is the purely aesthetic. First and lowest, but not to be ignored. First and lowest is the purely aesthetic. The second is the intellectual or educative. The third and the highest is the spiritual. The same thing he wrote in his future poetry, in his future poetry, he says there are three functions of art and poetry. Three functions only. And what are those three functions? He says to embellish life. To embellish life with beauty is only most outward functions of art and poetry, but not to be ignored. He says is only the most outward functions of art and poetry. To make life more intimately beautiful. To make life more intimately beautiful and noble and great and full of meaning is its higher office. But still it is not the highest office. But what is the highest of his? First one is aesthetic, second one is intellectual, third is spiritual. So he says, but its highest comes when the poet becomes the seer. Highest come when poet becomes the seer and reveals to man. What poet is to reveal to man? His eternal self. His eternal self and the Godheads of its manifestation. With my thanks and gratitude to Sahitya Akademi, I conclude here. Thank you.